Unfortunately, GPs have so little time. They only have 10 minutes with each person that they do not have the time to screen for mental illness by default. So you can imagine, like, if you had a tool that worked at the GP level and get it right 90% of the time, that's a massive improvement in and of itself.
In today's society, there remains a significant lack of diagnosis and support for individuals struggling with mental health issues. Emilia Molimpakis, the founder of Thymia, a company revolutionizing mental health assessments using cutting-edge gamification technology and AI. Hailing from the stunning Greek island of Crete, Emilia has studied neuroscience to PhD level, and coupled with a passion for video gaming and following a profound personal experience when a friend of hers tragically tried to take her own life, brought on by undiagnosed mental health issues, Emilia was determined to make a difference. Thymia is an online platform that utilizes specially designed video games based on neuropsychology combined with AI-driven analysis of video and speech data. Her team have developed this groundbreaking clinician support tool which aims to provide clinicians with vital insights, kind of bridging the gap between mental and physical health diagnosis. We talk a lot about this. Thymia's groundbreaking approach has earned them recognition. They were recently ranked in the top 10 European mental health companies. We cover her journey as an entrepreneur. We cover the differences between raising capital in the UK and the US, the shortcomings of current mental health diagnosis methods within the UK NHS, which I was shocked by. We also get Emilia's advice to those struggling with mental health issues and much, much more. This is one of the most important episodes that we have ever done. It's certainly one of the most important conversations I've ever had. I think you will take a lot of value from it. This is Emilia Molimpakis. Emilia, lovely to get you on the Tech Leaders podcast. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Been looking forward to this one. This is a topic that we've been looking to get somebody on to talk about mental health for quite some time. Your profile was very interesting to us. I understand you've been on Radio 5 Live and you've talked about this subject at length, and you've obviously got a story of your own. I just wanted to start off with the question that we always ask guests to kick things off, which is, what are the key ingredients of good leadership? And what does good leadership mean to you, Emilia?
It's a very good question, obviously, as it's also the subject of the podcast. For me, one of the first ingredients is empathy, which maybe isn't that common, but it's something that has defined me as a person. And so when I became a CEO, it just naturally became my style of leadership is empathy, understanding the people around me so that I can get them to do the best job they possibly can. When they're relaxed and happy, they can do their best work. I think having a very kind of clear set of rules and guidelines internally as to what is and isn't crossable, ethically speaking, is very important, particularly in tech and in healthcare. So I think those things like a clear vision and what guidelines and rules you want to take as an organization together with empathy, that brings out the best. And it also creates naturally the type of environment you would want your company to have. I think it just naturally occurs as a result.
Sure. Does leadership come natural to you?
I think I've always kind of naturally been a leader in terms of I've always led projects. At school, I was annoyingly probably the one who was always more bossy and kind of saying what we should be doing, all those things. So I kind of always had an inclination, but it's certainly been a very steep learning curve going from academia into directly being a CEO. It wasn't the pathway I was anticipating, to be honest. And it's definitely been a very interesting kind of learning journey. So I had to find my own style. I tried very much to adapt to try and be what everybody says in these books that you need to be the perfect boss or CEO. None of it ever worked for me. Probably was very much a learning experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's rewind back then, Emilia. I know you're from the absolutely stunning island of Crete. I went there last year. as we were talking about in the preamble. I just wanted to ask you about your early days. I just wanted to phrase the question like this: what did you want to be when you grew up? Okay, and can you just talk us through the sort of early part of your life that set you on the path that you ultimately went on?
I wanted to be a mixture of things. So after I got over wanting to be a dinosaur, which was what I wanted when I was 2 years old,
I wanted to be a dinosaur as
which is
well.
very nice ambition. After that, I think, yeah, I very much was very interested in genetics, epidemiology, neuroscience. Those were always really, really kind of strong recurring themes. My family ended up talking me out of going into neuroscience. I ended up going into Greek philology instead, which is basically means I studied language, linguistics, and Greek history and culture
Oh,
at
wow.
university.
That's really
So very
interesting.
different, but I was always still very, very keen on neuroscience. And so
Yeah.
when the opportunity came up to basically have a specialization in linguistics, which was called neuro-linguistics or
Yeah.
psycholinguistics, where you analyzed through language the functioning of someone's brain, I found that so incredibly interesting.
That is fascinating. Yeah, sure.
And I had the opportunity to go to a hospital in Greece where I worked with Alzheimer's patients, Parkinson's patients, and basically looking at how they use language and seeing how that was different from people same age and gender who didn't have that condition.
Sorry, can I just basically, I cannot stop myself because I heard something before which I was absolutely fascinated by, and maybe you can shed some light on it. So I heard about the concept of color, and I was
Mhm.
reading that there was an indigenous tribe of people, I think it was in the Amazon, who didn't have a word for the in their language for the color blue, so therefore blue didn't exist in their minds, in their world, so to speak, and therefore they just saw it as another shade of green. So do you know what I mean? So the question is, how much does language shape our perception of reality? Do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a kind of a well-defined language theory, which is basically the limits of my language are the limits of my world. That's what kind of was thought. I think at this point, some people do still believe that. I think mostly it's kind of been found to be, well, you do have a representation of that concept in your mind. It's just experienced slightly differently, potentially. So I think there was also like a tribe who had only variants of black and red in order to express colors, but obviously they didn't perceive the whole world as just black and red,
Yeah.
but it was just different words. Same with like Eskimos, that they have 50 different words for snow, but obviously they'll have a little bit more specialty, but it's not entirely determined by that. I think what's more interesting is not so much that language determines your thinking, but that thinking determines your language. So more the opposite way.
Ah, yes, of course. Yeah, that makes sense.
So basically, one of the big things I found out really early on is if you want to understand how someone's brain works in general, if you want to understand ordered or normal thinking, you need to first understand disordered thinking because you can see patterns a lot more strongly there. And one of
Yeah.
the patterns that I've always used to understand that thinking is language. So you'll see a disorder through language predominantly, and that helps you understand the brain more generally.
Right. Okay. I just find that I could talk to you about that all day, but we'd better move on. We better move on just in case. So yeah. So sorry, I
Yeah.
stopped you in your tracks there, Amelia. You were
Yeah.
talking about that. Obviously, you got into philology, and
Mhm.
that set you on a path. Then.
Yeah, so I did my thesis in undergrad on how Alzheimer's patients use syntax and semantics differently to people who do not have that condition, but
Yeah.
who match them in age and gender.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I ended up applying for a master's at UCL. I got funding to go. Then that kind of set me on the trajectory of neuroscience. So I ended up going into neuroscience and then kind of working, did a master's, PhD, postdocs, looking at different kinds of populations and doing everything from EEG experiments to fMRI to just brain scans, but always through the kind of the lens of language use. That was always my specialty, and that's part of what I bring to Themia as well, is that kind of angle of looking at thinking through language, essentially.
Yeah. Sure. Sure. So talk us through how you ended up in London. Then, did you always see yourself as an academic? Talk us through that part of your life where you decided to continue your studies and not just go and get a job in industry.
Yeah, I think from probably being quite young, I knew I wanted to be a researcher or an academic. I just didn't know exactly what I wanted to research, but I loved learning
Yeah.
and I loved kind of exploring and finding out that stuff. That was always like super, super relevant and interesting. So it was never a question, do I want to do a PhD? It was just, what's it going to be on? I ended up going to UCL because I read a paper, somebody wrote like a really great paper on Alzheimer's, like syntax use in Alzheimer's. I messaged the actual author, something I probably wouldn't do these days, having been an academic. But I messaged the author and said, hey, I love your paper. I love this area. Where should I study? And
Yeah.
they said, well, one of my ex PhD students has just started a program at UCL. She's the best I know in this area. You should talk to her. So I ended up messaging her and she said, oh, we've got a new program. You should apply. And I did. I got accepted and then ended up kind of continuing on with her and doing my PhD with her and a postdoc there as well. I kind of dabbled a little bit outside of that department, going into the Wellcome Trust for a while, but it was never a question, do I want to be an academic? It was definitely, I'll be in academia always. It
Yeah.
was more leaving academia that was the new thing, I guess, that was not expected, but ended up
Yeah.
happening.
Prior to obviously starting your venture, I noticed
Mhm.
you had some experience working on video games,
Yes.
and obviously there's a big neuro linguistic element to computer games. I've
Yes.
seen pictures, scans of the brain when people are playing video games and things. That a lot's going on up there, isn't
Yes.
it? First of all, how did that video game thing come about, and when was the eureka moment where you saw the opportunity for gamification to achieve other outcomes aside from just playing games? You know what I mean? The pleasure of playing games. You know?
Yeah, so I worked with a gaming company briefly, and basically the gaming company wanted to have a competitive edge, let's say, over others in the same area, and they wanted the competitive edge to be driven by science. So you would use science to basically make the game levels progressively harder,
Right.
because it was a word-based game. They needed someone who had expertise in language and psycholinguistics in particular. So they came to UCL. It was kind of towards the end of my PhD, beginning of a postdoc. I worked part time with this company to help them make the video game basically progressively harder.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that pushed me into analyzing other games. And I realized actually there are quite a lot of games that use psycholinguistic principles to make the levels progressively harder. I hadn't seen anyone using it to measure cognition, just to use linguistics basically to drive forward the gaming element rather than using the gaming element to drive forward an analysis of someone's brain. So I'd seen it one way, I hadn't seen it the other. And at the time, I was still kind of interested in disordered thinking. So looking at things like semantic dementia or Alzheimer's, where you lose concepts, so word concepts. And I suggested to the company, hey, did you realize that if you changed this a little bit, you could target Alzheimer's? You could use it to help people. And they're like, well, that sounds interesting, but we're not really keen to do that.
Wow.
And I was like, okay. Then my best friend, who was also an academic, kind of went through this whole deterioration phase. Like she always had anxiety and depression, but I saw her then really kind of go downhill and fall through the cracks in the system.
Yeah.
What ended up happening was I realized a lot of the research and all the things we've been finding out about the brain and about depression, about Alzheimer's, they're still stuck in research and clinicians aren't being exposed to it. They can't use it. And if only my friend's clinician had these kinds of tools, it could
Yeah.
have helped to figure out what was wrong sooner.
You believed in it that much, then you immediately
Yes.
right. This can help a diagnosis. Like it was that
Yes.
clear.
It was 100% clear. I'd thought about it for Alzheimer's. I hadn't thought about it necessarily for depression. But I was like, okay, well, obviously her clinician must have asked her these questions, or they
Yeah.
must have gone into a test to test her language, test her memory, to test stuff. And it was like, no, he basically asked her on a scale of 1 to 4 in the past 2 weeks, how sad have you felt? Or have you
Mm,
felt like harming yourself? And obviously, she's a very intelligent person. She wasn't going
yeah.
to admit to things. So he basically said, okay, she's well enough to go home with a prescription for antidepressants. And then 2 days later, she tried to take her own life. And when that happened, we were meant to be meeting on the day and she didn't show up. So I went to her house and I found her, thankfully, which was very fortunate, also very, very unfortunate as an event, but it really pushed me. And I managed to talk to the guy and I said, well, what happened? And he told me, he asked the questions and she answered and she didn't seem to be in distress. I was like, well, surely you use more than that. You don't just use questions. They're like, no, that's what we use. And I spoke to him. I spoke to dozens of other psychiatrists and clinicians, and it was just always the same thing. And I was like, but tech and research has advanced so much more. We know so much more. We can tell someone has depression from their language use, from their face, from their movements, from their reactions. Why aren't we using this?
Yeah, wow.
I was like, okay, well then if this gaming company doesn't want to do it, I'll do it. That was just it. And so I just quit and went and did it.
This just makes so much sense to me, because if you're a clinician and you've got a patient and you believe that they're just giving you a facade, they're giving you a story and you can see there's more there. I mean, asking them to play a game, as long as they accept to engage in that activity, I mean, there's not many other ways you can get under the bonnet and find out what's going on. I think it's genius. Emilia, I'm sure there must be others doing this. This must be gamification for this purpose must be a thing now. How advanced is this and how widespread are people using these techniques?
So I think it's both common in some areas, not so much in the ones we're looking at. So there are the companies using games to help treat some mental conditions. So embedding CBT, for instance, within games, or using gamification to treat ADHD. That's something that's been done quite a bit, and it works really well.
Yeah.
There haven't been many people doing exactly what we do, which is basically using gamification to feed very complex AI models. So, what we specialize in is the games are a medium, let's say, to gather all of the data we need, which spans different modalities. So, we gather through our games, which are very simple, we gather voice data, which is from my specialty and also our chief science officer specialty. So, there we're analyzing both how somebody sounds and what they're saying. Secondly, we gather video data. So if they're happy for us to switch on the camera while they play, we'll basically look at their facial expressions. So overlay a grid on their face and look at all the points and see how
Yeah.
those move. And
Oh,
eye gaze
wow. Okay.
patterns,
Yeah.
upper body movements as well. So say, for instance, twitching, very relevant in ADHD, slack, facial expressions, very relevant in depression. But also we analyze how you're behaving inside the game. So if we show you a card, do you react quickly to it? Do you react slowly? Do you make mistakes? How do you tap? Where are you tapping? All of those kind of like thousands of data points are going into the models. And that's really what drives the product is the models. The games are a way of getting the data. So it needs a lot of AI expertise, a lot of neuroscience and psychology and linguistics expertise to build these kinds of tools. So hence I think it hasn't been used as much. Even now, we know a lot of companies using, say, voice analysis for depression.
Yeah.
We've not seen anyone using all three of those at the moment. So I think it's starting to be used, but it definitely could be used a lot more.
Right. Are the NHS using these techniques on a significant scale, or is this still very early?
So I think, unfortunately, the NHS isn't that welcoming to new techniques and new technologies. They make it very difficult to pilot stuff. So there is not as much incentive for a small company like ours to expend an enormous amount of resources to get into the NHS. Obviously, we want this to be made available to everyone, but it's a difficult process of selling into the NHS. You have to sell into every, I think they're called ICBs now, they used to be CCGs. There used to be 200 of them. You need to sell into each one separately.
Yeah.
They make it very difficult. I have some hope now that the government's announced, I think it's 21 million funding for AI innovation to be introduced to the NHS. I'm really hopeful. But the private sector is using this a lot more than the NHS is. I've seen other public health systems use this or like embrace AI way faster and much easier than the UK one does, unfortunately.
Yeah, sure. Talk us about Thymia.
Yes.
How did that come about? Where did that come from? Talk us through where that came from and the initial part of getting that from concept to product.
So I think I knew that we could use these techniques. Like, so from an academic perspective, it just made complete sense. Once I saw the gamification element, that also kind of fit in really nicely. I was like, well, this makes so much sense. Also, I've been an avid gamer since I was like 2 years old or
It
something.
helps.
So helps a lot. I was always like really, really keen on games. I find them really calming.
Yeah, sure.
But what happened was essentially all this happened with my friend, and within a period of maybe a few weeks, I kind of had this urge to do something and to help people like my friend, because I felt so guilty about not realizing sooner how bad her condition was and about not acting. And I felt like this sense of responsibility towards her. I couldn't help her at that point. So she was hospitalized for a while. And I just couldn't get out of my head that I could have helped her or I could have helped other people. And so it was just a period of weeks during which I was like, okay, how do I stop this from happening again to other people or to her? I need to do this. How do I do it? And so I knew I needed someone to help me build it, but I didn't know how to find that person.
Mm,
And it just so happened that somebody from Entrepreneur First here in London,
sure.
they reached out to me. I mean, one thing they do quite well, EF, is they know where to find people. So they reached out to me and said, hey, there's a cohort coming together. Do you want to be part of it?
Yeah.
I was like, okay, I've never heard of you guys, but let me see what you do. I was like, actually, this is fantastic. This is exactly what I need. So I joined straight away. I was like, yep, cool. I'll apply. I got in. Then COVID hit, and we were the first pandemic cohort. So just as COVID hit, moved to London back. I was in Oxford at the time, so I moved back to London. And I had this really daunting challenge of meeting 100 people on the cohort over the period of 2-3 weeks, all remotely, and trying to find a co-founder.
So were the people you were talking to, were they all sort of
Mm.
CTOs, like coders, essentially? Then is that what you were going for? Or was it more commercial people, or a bit of both?
I think when I joined, I was looking more for kind of more of the commercial side. I thought, oh, I'll end up basically being the chief science officer or the chief technology officer. I don't think it ever crossed my mind I would be the CEO
Yeah,
of the company. I always thought I'd be a co-founder and
sure,
etc.
sure.
And then I met Stefano, who ended up being my co-founder, and we were both teamed up in different teams at the time. But there was just something about how we spoke about stuff, how he understood what I wanted to do, and he had all these ideas.
Yeah,
I was like, well, actually, if we work together, we can bring in so much more into this
yeah, yeah.
than if I was just working with a commercial person. And it just organically evolved into what Thymia is today. And so I ended up becoming the CEO and having to learn very quickly what that entailed.
Mm,
EF is a very much venture capital driven company like Y Combinator.
yeah,
And it's very much you found a company and then you just get pushed out to fundraise.
yeah, absolutely.
And
That all happens very quickly, I'm sure, as well.
it happens very, very quickly. Within 3 months, kind of pushed out to fundraise, which was way too soon.
You obviously raised capital
Mm,
pretty quickly then.
yeah.
Entrepreneur First obviously helped you a lot in that journey. So you had a seed raise, is that right? So where are you at now in your sort of runway, investment journey? Whereabouts are you?
So we've done 2 pre-seed rounds. It's not announced yet, but we're doing seed right now, essentially.
Yeah.
So I can't say too much about
No,
that just
sure.
yet, but we are doing crowdfunding actually soon as well
Yeah,
to kind of
sure.
top stuff up. Yeah, so we're at seed stage,
Okay,
basically.
brill. So looking back now from when the concept arose, right,
Hmm.
so where you are now, because you've been on a bit of a journey over the last 2 years
Yeah.
or 2 or 3 years, what would you have done different, Emilia?
I think one of the biggest lessons, well, 2 lessons we learned. One was don't go out to raise until you're fully ready. And what fully ready means is very different across the different sectors. But what we found out was that European and UK VCs don't understand AI particularly well. And so going out to raise as a deep tech company, particularly nowadays, they are looking for commercial metrics. They are looking for stuff to be working, to be proven out.
Yeah,
They're very risk averse. Like if you look at the stack, say, of risks, they look at you as a pancake stack of risks. That pancake stack is massive if you're a UK European VC versus in the US, much, much lower, much more risk friendly. I think we just didn't know when we went to raise about that kind of the difference between US and UK EU. And we went out to raise sooner than we should have done. I think we should have spent more time.
could you just unpack that in a very
Yeah.
high level way? Was that because
Yeah.
I wasn't aware that I knew there was a difference in terms of risk profile, but I didn't realize it was that profound.
I think it's more about kind of the profile, like rather the the risk aversity of the funds themselves. So UK
Okay.
and European funds are way more risk averse, particularly in the past year. They've become even more so, obviously, understandably with the market,
Sure.
but they see AI as a massive kind of risk profile in itself. So deep tech, much less willing to take a gamble on it. And even if they do, the valuations are so much lower than in the US. And they just look at you and they're basically saying, okay, AI represents a commercial risk, it represents a regulation risk, it represents in health tech health risk as well. So basically, they're just stacking those risks. And
Okay.
instead, in the US, they look at you and they say, oh, AI, you guys are amazing. The potential for this is phenomenal. We're going to back you now before you have stuff going, kind of thing, which is very different. In the UK and Europe, they don't do that as easily. I think had we known, either we would have gone to the US straight away to raise,
Yeah.
or we would have waited to build out a bit more of the product before going to fundraise in UK and EU. We learned that the hard way. The second thing we learned, or which was, I think every founder finds that out, is don't chase the easy money for commercialization. If you see an opportunity and it kind of takes you away from what your vision is,
Yeah.
don't take it. Stick with the vision. If you have to pivot in order to get like commercial success, make sure you're doing that still within the vision. You're not sacrificing kind of your end goal for that, because ultimately you will pay for that. So I think that's something we learned as well.
Yeah. So let's go back to the product a bit more then,
Sure.
Amelia. I'm really keen to understand the product development journey that you guys have been on. Can you tell us about
Mhm.
maybe when you first started, how long it took you to get to the point of having a ready to go product?
Yeah. So when we started, we basically needed a way to gather data to train our AI models. We always knew kind of the models would be the core value driver of Thymia, and games were the ways was the way basically we would gather the data, but we needed a way to host the games. So we ended up building out a full research platform, let's say the Thymia platform, that has all of the games and all of the all the tech you need to gather voice, video, and behavior data. And we built like it's probably like the among the best in the world for that purpose, if not the best.
Yeah.
And that's what we used to feed the model. So that took a while. Once we had that, the question then became, okay, how do we commercialize this? And this is, I think, where maybe we could have done things potentially differently. If we were US based, I think we would have focused just on developing the tech, not
Yeah.
selling. Because of the way that European and UK VCs and also the market works here, we wanted to commercialize as soon as possible. So we started offering the platform as it was to research groups so they could use it to gather data themselves. That was the first way we commercialized, which worked well. And then we wanted, though, to get this into the hands of clinicians so they could use it, they could feed us data, we make the models better, and we help them in the process. So we ended up having as the core the Themia platform, and we built out kind of a full end-to-end SaaS clinician suite around it. So we did everything from booking admin stuff to hosting telehealth to note taking, and the games fit there, so you could assign them to your patients. And this kind of comes back to us seeing there was like clinicians were struggling to do telehealth, teletherapy, and stuff with their patients. So if they don't have a platform for us to plug into, how on earth are they going to use the games? So we'll build the platform for you. That was the first version of the product, essentially. We did that with a few clinics, but then the more we grew, the more we realized a lot of clinics, particularly abroad, had their own telehealth platforms. So they were asking for bits and pieces. So we ended up just giving them modules more than anything. And that kind of just ended up being, well, the more we're breaking down the platform, the more it makes sense to just maybe convert this to kind of just APIs and widgets instead of a full suite. And so we did that in, I think, about 6, 9 months ago. We started doing that, and that's what we're now selling. I think the other big thing we did was we started clinical, like really strongly clinical, and we only worked with psychiatrists, neuropsychologists. One of the really interesting things Themia does is we analyze all these types of data and we can tell whether someone may or may not have a condition. So we specialize in depression, anxiety, recently ADHD as well. But what we do, which no one else does, is because of the modalities, we can look at the different symptoms that someone has. So I can see whether, say, you, Gareth, may have anxiety. And if you do, how exactly are you experiencing it? Do you have sleep issues? Do you have mood issues, attention problems, etc.? And each of these requires a slightly different treatment by the clinician. So what we've started doing now is we realized symptom tracking is relevant not just clinically, it's relevant in a lot of other places. So if you have a tool that can track your fatigue levels, that's not just relevant when you're depressed. It's not just relevant to psychiatrists, it's relevant to anyone, really. It's relevant to any big employer who wants to help their employees. It's relevant in safety critical environments. So think of places like pilots, air traffic control operators, miners, surgeons. It's relevant there. So we ended up starting to sell our APIs into the wellness sector as well. So that's kind of the next iteration of the product is APIs, clinical, but then also wellness now as well.
What about wearables then, which capture real-time data on health things? I mean, would that plug into your product?
Definitely, yeah. Wearables are something we've been considering for a while now. We already have multimodal data, so there's a bit of a difference with wearables in the sense that early on we took a strong kind of ethical stance that we don't want to passively track people because particularly people with depression and anxiety, they feel it's very invasive for them.
Yeah,
So
sure.
we gather data through our games and through actively eliciting speech. Wearables are more on the passive tracking side, and it does very much fit in. In fact, our chief science officer has published papers on how do you combine wearables, voice, etc., to track cognition. So it's a natural next step. I think probably we're maybe a year away from that at least.
Yeah, sure. Can we just dig in very quickly into the user side? Okay, so if you're, if you and I were having a session and you're a clinician and I'm a patient, you would essentially we would have a conversation, and you would like sort of, as part of the diagnosis, you would get me to play or to engage with one of these games, yeah, and then.
Mhm.
So, do you know, me as the user, would I know that, like, how conscious or how obvious would it be that this game is tracking my mental well-being?
So basically, the user journey is if we're ever talking about the clinical side, you come to me as a clinician. Before our first session, I would typically assign you a set of Thymia games. Essentially, there's about 4 or 5 of them that you might get, and each one takes about 2 to 3 minutes to go through. So the whole thing is about 10 to 15 minutes. And you
Yeah,
basically just play a few of these games. You know that they're being sent for assessment, but you don't really know what each one is measuring exactly, because we don't want you to know, but you know very clearly that you're being assessed. We make it very clear as well that we say basically, we're going to play a game now. We need you to switch on your microphone and your camera for this. Are you okay with that? Do you give us
yeah,
permission to do that? So you're aware. And then as part of the game on the side, you can see your face and you get a sign that basically when you're talking that we're recording. But then the games themselves, they're very basic, but you can't really know what you're meant to be doing. So one, for
yeah,
instance, is a card game. So we show you cards one after the other. It's a bit like Snap. So when you see a card that matches the immediately previous one, you're supposed to tap. And when you tap, we're recording your face, you're tapping. Here, you're not talking, so we're not recording speech. But that's one example. We have another
yeah,
one
sure.
where you have like an animated image that moves. So it's like a cartoon that moves as you talk. And we basically get you to describe what you're seeing. Now,
Hmm.
of course, we're looking for something very specific when you're describing. So we're looking for things like flatness, intonation, the words you use. Like if you're depressed, we expect a lot more personal pronoun use than when you're not depressed.
Yeah,
This is because when you're depressed, you kind of fixate more inwardly. But basically, we're looking for patterns. But you know that we're recording you. And once you've done that, the clinician gets a report so they can go through it with you in the session. And then after the session, your original assessment works as your baseline, and we continue to compare yourself to that. So that's kind of how it works, clinically speaking. In the
yeah, sure.
wellness space, it's a little bit different, but basically, we do something very similar, and the outputs are just more softer, let's say. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. The reason I asked that question, though, is because I just think if somebody is conscious, obviously we know you can't really do it without them knowing. They'd obviously know they're getting screened,
Hmm.
but if they get lost in the game,
Hmm.
do you know what I mean? If they get into the game and they get lost in the
Yeah.
game, then you're obviously going to get a more authentic response, aren't you, from them? I was just keen how you achieve that, because I see that as the biggest drawback to accurate data. Are you getting a facade of them, or are you getting the real them in your data capture?
Yeah, I think it is a very valid point. Like obviously when you know somebody's recording you, you're going to behave a little bit differently to when you don't. But one thing I always tell people is you have the impact of knowing that you're being recorded, but that does fade over time.
Yeah,
So people who we do this several times a day, for instance, sometimes they get so comfortable with it that eventually that kind of gets lost, that
yeah,
aspect of being recorded. The other thing, of course, that happens, which is stronger as an effect, is learning effect. People learn how to play the game. So they learn to get better at the game. So that's more of a stronger signal that we need to take out so that we learn and see, okay, this person is learning. Let's see the actual symptom signal
yeah,
rather than the learning effect itself. So that's more
yeah.
of a stronger pattern, actually.
So, in terms of, you must have had, feedback on this, and you must have an idea of how accurate this is. I'm sure you get some people it may not work on so well, and others it hits the nail on the head type thing. So, how do you measure effectiveness, and how accurate is this for diagnosis?
Yeah, so it's a very difficult area to define accuracy in mental health, particularly depression and anxiety,
Yeah, sure.
given we're basically trying to make a model that can diagnose and can assess better than a clinician can. But how do you train that model? So it's a lot of triangulation. So the what we use kind of as a tool is basically the kind of the golden truth, or the real truth that we're trying to get to, the ground truth is, how does this compare to a clinician's kind of diagnosis? So a clinician must have verified this person has depression. They must have
Yeah,
had it for at least 3 years. They must have been on treatment and responded well to the treatment. And then they must continue to experience depressive symptoms over a period of time. So that's kind of like what we're using to train against. And then we're seeing whether we can actually predict that then in new people coming in. We started out with accuracy of, say, about 65, 70% versus that. We're at the point now where our work in progress models are over 90% across kind of all of those aspects. It does change depending on age, and it does change depending on gender and culture. So
yeah,
it's much, much better if you can use the individual user as a baseline. And then we basically, what we do is, if we have someone play this at least 4 or 5 times, we build a separate model for that individual person over time. So
yeah.
that's the
Gotcha.
most accurate way. But I think something actually that's worth mentioning is you see a lot of papers being written that claim these astronomical kind of 99% accuracy at doing something through voice. It's impossible that they're
There's
getting
no
that
way you'd
accuracy.
know that, is there?
There's no way. And also, you don't see them actually breaking down the results by age or by gender or anything that could be affecting the results. That's the
Yeah,
key thing. And you don't see them doing that, because if they did that, the accuracy would drop spectacularly.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
what you're basically seeing in a lot of these cases is that actually they're not measuring the effect of voice, or the effect of depression on voice, they're measuring age or gender. So, one of
yeah.
the
Sure.
confounding variables instead.
Yeah, sure. I'm sure the feedback from the clinician is a big part of this as well,
Yeah.
though, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
they know their patient better than anyone else. I think if they think that the results are really relevant to what they
Mm.
suspected was the case anyway, then
Yeah.
that's a pretty good basis for a diagnosis, isn't it? Surely. So,
Yeah, I think Themia's kind of main value is helping the clinician land on a diagnosis, but also more seeing over time how the patient is evolving and whether the treatment they've decided on actually works for them. And
mm,
if there's a deterioration between sessions, can the clinician capture it? Well, with Themia, you basically can. We've seen some clinics we work with use kind of a green, amber, and red light system. So when Themia in between sessions detects there's something happening in deterioration, they get a warning essentially, and then they call up the patient. And typically that works really well. Obviously, all of this is still investigational capacity. We're getting regulatory approval like right now. But thus far, we've had really, really great feedback from clinicians on it.
yeah, sure. So let's dip into mental health a little bit then,
Mhm.
Amelia. So this is obviously a subject which inspired you to build a business and a product. So,
Yeah.
what do you think about how mental health is being diagnosed at the moment, and how much room for improvement is there?
Yeah. It's quite grim, actually,
I
unfortunately.
had a feeling you were going to say that.
Yeah, it is pretty grim. And the unfortunate situation is in the UK, let's say, as a particular example,
Sure.
most mental health assessments go through the GP. And unfortunately, GPs have so little time. They only
Yeah.
have 10 minutes with each person, maybe 5 in some cases, that they do not have the time to screen for mental illness by default. You only get screened with questions if you come with a complaint. So there automatically you're excluding a load of people who don't know they have a condition or don't want to talk about it, etc. So there's so many people falling through the cracks. When you do get screened, unfortunately, at that GP level, fewer than 50% of cases are diagnosed accurately. So you're getting off to a really bad start. If
Yeah.
you're not even being kind of assessed for the right type of mental illness. So about 50% of cases, less, like it's worse than chance level, they get it right. When they do think that you have an issue, you're then kind of sent to a specialist. And the waiting time then is horrific. It depends on the condition. But say for
Yeah.
depression, you could be waiting 6 to 12 months to see someone. For ADHD, the current waiting list, I think in the NHS, is 5 years for an
Wow.
ADHD diagnosis.
That's crazy, isn't it?
So you can imagine, like, if you had a tool that worked at the GP level, basically just screen by default and get it right 90% of the time, that's a massive improvement in and of itself. Um,
Yeah.
but that's kind of the situation right now in terms of diagnosis. And really, again, they just have questions. I think there's a lot of talk about access to mental health care. So people not seeing a clinician, not having access to a clinician, that's a massive deal. People don't talk about so much the types of people who get access. There's so many people who get overlooked. If you're just relying on questions, children aren't able to answer questions very well.
No.
Older, confused patients can't answer questions very well. And there's so many people who are nonverbal, say like severely autistic people, they can't express themselves. So if they
No.
have mental health comorbidities there, or if there's something happening, they fall through the cracks in the system even more.
So what is plan B then? Are we just completely relying on conversational answers to questions? Is that literally it?
So for mood disorders, so for things like anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, personality disorder, bipolar, yes, it's entirely questions based. ADHD and autism is a little bit different. You get to do some more cognitive functioning tests, but
Yeah.
it, it takes 7 to 8 hours to diagnose someone with ADHD. Can you imagine having
Yeah.
ADHD and having to sit for 8 hours to do a session? That's also wrong. That's also problematic in
Yeah,
itself.
absolutely. Then why have they got reservations with AI and gamification for this purpose then? Because the current system clearly isn't working. Why are they not engaging with people like yourself, companies like yours? Why have they not embraced this type of thing, or at least any innovation?
I think it's just bureaucracy, to be honest. The way the NHS is structured and how small companies can engage with them is
Yeah.
so flawed on so many levels that it's so problematic. We have partners we work with in Brazil, in the US, in Africa, in Indonesia, Spain, Greece, Italy. They all embrace it so much more easily than the NHS does. Like in
Wow.
Africa, they're like, wow, you can help us fill a gap where we don't actually have specialist clinicians, and we're taking it on.
This makes so much sense to
It
me.
does. And it's cheap, it's effective.
Yeah, because the
Yeah.
status quo
Mm.
is clearly not fit for purpose. Clearly, it's not. We're probably going to look back at this in 10 years and think, what
Yeah.
on earth were we thinking, diagnosing this by, listening to people's answers to, just basically you get diagnosed whatever the patient tells you, not
Yes.
what we've actually measured. Do you know what I mean? So
Exactly. Yeah.
it's crazy, isn't it? Really bizarre.
Yeah, it is. I think it all comes down to just the way it's structured. So bureaucracy, fragmented system. I don't know whether it's poor management or whether it's also kind of a reservation in terms of how the UK is now regulating AI as well. That's kind of another thing that's going to become even more of a problem. But it certainly is not welcoming to new technology. I've
Mm.
spoken to quite a few companies, especially ex-EF companies, who decided instead of going private or going global, they wanted to target the NHS.
Yeah.
And more often than not, they've actually lost out and they spent too many resources and it didn't work out for them. So when you hear that as a startup, you try to get into the NHS, you see these same patterns, you're like, well, I don't want the company to go under with me trying to do the right thing. I'd rather we survive, we do an amazing job elsewhere and eventually get into the NHS, but it means it's going to take us a long time to get around to it, which is problematic. We're helping people abroad, we should be helping them here as well. Like the NHS should be accepting this kind of technology a lot more easily and readily than they are.
Yeah, no, absolutely, 100%. It's mind blowing, isn't it? So tell us a little bit about your global domination. Then you've obviously had traction in, well, from what I can gather, all 4 continents. I think you've your products in Brazil, in Africa, in Southeast Asia. So tell us a little bit about how you got this out to a more global user base.
Yeah, so we have been very lucky or good by design, I guess, from the beginning that our models, because they combine different types of data and they're not just tied to speech so strongly, we can basically make them transfer to any language, really.
Sure.
So that gives you a really strong competitive advantage. So we've been able very quickly to assess people in different languages.
Yeah.
And so geography was never a blocker for us. And also the fact that we now deploy via APIs also means it's very easy to just plug into any system. So we started to look at Brazil. I think that was the first one we looked at after the
Yeah.
UK, because also Gabrielle had like quite a strong network there. And they were so accepting of technology and mental health is just becoming more and more important to them that they just accepted us really quickly. And then it was the US. And then we just started saying, okay, where could we have the most impact? Let's reach out to companies or clinics in these areas to see if they're interested. And we reached out like to, I think Africa was one of the ones we reached out to. But then we had inbound from Spain, Indonesia, Italy, Greece. People just really want to use this.
So how did they find out about you then? Where did the inbound stuff come from?
We had like quite a lot of press. So we've been really lucky to get really a lot of press exposure. I think we have like 300 press articles on us at this point in different countries, which is really good. But we get a lot of inbound. Now we've done quite a strong outbound set of campaigns, but in the beginning, about 90% of our clients came via inbound, actually.
That's amazing. I mean, but
Mm.
not the NHS though, which is astonishing. But there we go.
Yeah, not the NHS.
So
Yeah.
can I just go back to? I wanted to
Mm.
ask you quite a serious question, okay?
Yeah.
Because I think this is a very serious topic, and a lot of people will be listening to this who may have a particular interest in this subject. Okay, so knowing what you know now and being involved in this space for the amount of time you've been involved in it, and your life experience and things to do with that as well. What advice do you give to people who are suffering from mental health issues, or being not listened to by their GP? What can they do? Where can they go?
It's difficult. It does depend on what exactly the problem is. But I think the most important thing is don't give up. Just because your GP isn't listening, or just because someone says to you, oh, you'll snap out of it, you're fine, it's all in your head, blah, blah, blah. It's not. Like, if you don't feel okay, if you're
Yeah,
experiencing, strong or even mild symptoms of fatigue, attention problems, memory issues, mood problems, if you feel like at any point that you just would rather this is over in any way, that's completely, utterly a real problem. And that is
yeah,
something you should be talking to people about and just make them listen. Just say it again and again and again. Actually, this is a problem to me. And if your GP doesn't listen, then reach out to people through helplines. If you can afford it, go privately. Unfortunately, even if you go privately, which is what my friend did, it doesn't mean that people will see what the problem is. But
no,
just
sure.
keep trying and also enlist the help of family and friends. They can be way more
Yeah,
supportive than you think. And I think just talking about it with people,
yeah.
raising that
Well,
awareness.
that's the big one, isn't it? Just talking
Yeah,
about it is such an enormous step forward, isn't it?
it
So
is. I mean, one of the things I said in my TED talk, and it's one of these things that always comes back again and again, which I keep repeating, is if you had a friend or a sister or brother who had blood sugar issues or was suspected of having diabetes,
Yeah.
you wouldn't question them kind of taking medication for it or needing to see someone, having to take blood tests and monitor it.
Yeah.
Why do we not extend that to mental health? It's just as
Yeah.
important.
It's crazy, isn't it?
Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not real.
Well, there's the answer. I mean,
Yeah,
because it's not as tangible, because we are not.
exactly.
Yeah, we're influenced by what we can see more than we realize, aren't we? So I
Yeah.
think, I think that's a really good point and a really good advice as well, Amelia. So looking back now to the beginning, to that young ambitious person growing up in Crete, or maybe student in London. Let's say your 21-year-old self. What advice would you give to your 21-year-old self?
I'm a recovering perfectionist. So I would definitely say to myself,
Recovering, that's great.
I am, yes. As a CEO, like in the beginning, you're just like, yes, perfect, perfect, perfect. No, perfect goes out the window
Yeah,
really
sure.
quickly. I would say learning that 70% is good enough. That's something like 70% done is more than good enough, and just go with it.
Yeah,
Don't obsess over perfection. That's something I
yeah,
should have learned really
yeah.
early.
Done beats perfect sometimes, doesn't
Yes,
it? You know?
done beats perfect. But also, if you have a dream of helping people or you have a certain thing that you really want to do, don't let anyone talk you out of it. I
Yeah,
let my
sure.
parents talk me out of neuroscience. I still somehow find my way back into neuroscience. Um, I wanted to do this thing with games. I didn't listen to people saying, "Oh, let's not do that. It's not commercial. It's not this. It's not lucrative." I wanted to do it. I wanted to help people, and I'm doing it. And whether this succeeds or not, I would not change that for the world.
Yeah, sure.
So it would be kind of just if you want to do this, do it. And if you are an academic, consider leaving it. Like consider leaving academia if you want to bridge the gap
Yeah,
between research and any kind of industry. Academics should be more. We should see more examples of people leaving. Like I
yeah,
never
sure.
saw anyone leave UCL in neuroscience to go do something better. Let's say I would have loved to have seen that. It would have been so inspirational.
So I wanted to ask you about AI. Your product is an AI product, but I'm keen to get your thoughts. This is obviously a space which has attracted so much attention in 2023. ChatGPT is changing so many things. Is changing perceptions of how we look at many things. It's going to have such a profound effect on many industries. What are you most excited about, Emilia, in relation to this AI revolution that we seem to be in at the moment?
I think the potential for time saving, probably, if we don't look
Yeah.
at, say, health care more directly and how AI impacts healthcare,
Yeah, sure.
which I think is profound.
Oh, yeah.
Just focusing, let's say, on large language models, they're not perfect. They are far from perfect, and people need to understand that. But it has so much potential for saving time and letting people focus on what people do best. So it's what we say also with clinicians. Like, we don't want to be the clinician. We don't want to do the clinician's job for them. We want to allow them, empower them to do what they do best, which is be empathetic, listening, etc. I think we'll see a revolution now with jobs as well. A lot of tasks and elements that took a disproportionate amount of time, those are all going to
Yeah.
be automated. I think we'll see a revolution similar to what we had, like when electricity first came about, or large machinery. I fully expect to see a similar revolution in the next
Yeah.
5-10 years. I'm so
100%.
excited for it. I
Yeah.
guess it's just, I think we are at the point where the average person's understanding of AI is not keeping up with the pace at which it's growing.
It's amazing that is, isn't it? How more people are not using some of these tools because it's
Yeah,
such an advantage. It's
it's
such an
amazing.
advantage, you
Yeah,
know?
it
Yeah.
is. But I think people just need to be a bit cautious about it as well. Like,
Yeah, sure. Sure.
a lot of these things are not being done in a fully transparent or ethical way. So as
Yeah.
long as you are aware of that, that's fine. And they can get things wrong a lot of the time, like ChatGPT. You tell it it's wrong, it will say, "Yes, you're right. I've been wrong," and it will change its answer 5 times. Like
Yeah.
it's not 100% accurate, but
No, 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 of
provided you're
course not.
aware of it, you can use it so well.
Oh, 100%. It's unbelievable. Just
Yeah,
same question. What are you most fearful of?
I think I hesitate to say regulation
Mm,
because I think AI is phenomenal, but it needs to be transparent. So you need to be understanding why it's saying certain things. It's not just a black box anymore, because we've moved away from a black box version of AI. There's ways of creating explainable handles within models. And so I think we should be doing that. I also think people should be very transparent. Like if you go to a website and you're like, God forbid, you're going to like a therapist and you get a chatbot and you don't know it's a chatbot, that can be very problematic. So being transparent and ethical about when a human is interacting with a machine, the lines have blurred now. We don't know when we're interacting with a machine, which can be so problematic. So I think the way to do this responsibly, and what I'm most afraid of, is basically having the right safeguards in place.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
what makes me fearful is I see the people who are putting the safeguards in place and they don't know what they're doing most of the time.
Yeah, I think that's there's not many people who do know what they are doing. It is such a
Yeah,
new space, isn't it?
it is.
That's the challenge we've got.
I guess it's kind of like over-regulating and under-regulating are both really big concerns, but also really big potential realities at this point. So yeah, I think it's quite scary thinking that the person regulating this doesn't know what AI is, and they may go either way. They may completely underregulate, so it makes it very unsafe, or they may make it so hard to fulfill the requirements that they stifle innovation. So I think we're really at that kind of like, we're balancing on kind of like, I don't know if that's an expression in English, but in Greek, there's like, you're balancing on a blade and it can
Yeah.
kind of cut you either way. You can fall
Yeah,
either way.
sure.
I think we're definitely at that point.
That tipping point, yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
exactly. Very much.
I completely agree. That totally makes sense. It's an exciting couple of years ahead, isn't it? I
Yeah.
think it's just incredible. The pace of innovation is unbelievable. In terms of innovation and maybe AI tools and productivity, have you got any tool recommendations, any productivity advice for the listeners on how you stay organized and how your productivity has maybe come on since sort of these AI tools started springing up everywhere?
I think probably I'm not using them to the best advantage. I do use ChatGPT quite a lot.
Yeah, yeah,
I think learning to use it with prompts and teaching it is really, really good.
yeah, sure.
For me, my productivity is still very much actually tied to habits. And so, like for me, what boosts my productivity is more kind of I exercise a lot more now than I used to. When I founded Thymia, I quit everything other than Thymia. Now I've brought back like exercise and finding time for the gym and things that really boost my
Yeah,
productivity. And
absolutely.
also for me, it's always been about like having a relaxation space or relaxation frame and a working frame. And
Yeah.
that is like being able to basically separate those two things out. So when you're working, you're wearing certain clothes, you're working in a certain room, you're going to your workplace, that boosts productivity versus when you come home, the ability to switch off and let your brain relax and kind of recharge. That's still, I think, the most, like the best way that we can boost our productivity. I'm sure if you ask me in 6 months, I'll have a very different answer based on AI tools I'll have tried.
Well, this is the thing. Everything's
Yeah.
changing on a daily
Yeah.
basis, isn't it? But look, last question then, Emilia. Where can people find you and find out about you and what you guys are doing at the moment? And have you got anything exciting coming up you wanted to mention?
Yeah, so you can find us on our website. So it's www.thymia, so that's THYMIA.ai. And if you'd like to trial out the product to your clinic or your therapist, or maybe you're a wellness provider, just reach out through the website. You can also follow us on LinkedIn. We're building an Instagram now. It's haven't kept up with the kids, so to speak. So you can definitely find us there. We are going live now across 4 continents, as I mentioned. So that's something really, really exciting. And both our clinical and our wellness products are live. So I'm really excited about the year to come. Something we're super excited about is that we are actually crowdfunding. So throughout July, anyone really can support us through Crowdcube. So you can be part of the Themia journey. Even if you're not an investor, average person, they can all be part of the Themia journey. So we're really excited about that and would love to see people there.
And you did a speech at an event
Yeah.
alongside Barack Obama. Is that true? Did you get to
Yes.
meet the great man?
I saw him briefly. I didn't get to meet him. The Secret Service was very, very, they were very strong in their presence. But I did get to meet other amazing people.
Glenn Close was there as well, wasn't
Yes.
she? I didn't know she
Yeah.
was involved in that type of stuff, but that's amazing.
Yeah. I got to meet Goldie Hawn and Nia
Oh,
Vardalos.
whoa, that's
It
an
was
A-lister.
really cool. Yeah, they were amazing. There was so many people. It was a real privilege to speak there, especially in Greece where mental health is not talked about very much.
Yeah,
It was a
sure.
privilege to be part of that. So yeah, it was fantastic. Really, really loved it.
Fantastic. Well, it's been a great couple of weeks for you, topped off by an appearance on the Tech Leaders podcast,
Yes.
eh? So,
Best thing. Best thing
well,
yet.
Emilia, it's been lovely to meet you and lovely to talk to you. I mean, it's
Thank
a
you so
conversation
much.
I won't forget for a long time. I think we've covered some amazing areas here. And I think, I've really enjoyed it. So thank you so much. Thanks for coming on the Tech Leaders podcast.
Likewise. Thank you.
There was so much to take away from that conversation. I think Emilia was charming, very easy to talk to. I think we could have gone on for a lot longer. But I'm trying to think and process the conversation. I've just got off the call now, and I think it's really difficult for me to see past some of the things that came up, which may not be the normal things we focus on at the Tech Leaders podcast, because we always try to home in on things which are of value. But I do think this is of value, but in a different way. And I can't really see past some of the shocking things that she pointed out to me. Maybe I'm naive, but I just couldn't believe how archaic and how basically we rely on subjective observations to diagnose mental health issues, and also things like autism and ADHD and things like that. There just seems to be a real lack of scientific objective measures to, just a lack of data capture to really diagnose these very complex issues. If it's a physical injury, there's always, there's objective ways we can assess the injury, so to speak, through x-rays or, scans or whatever, or, other things. But with mental health issues, I understand it's far more complex in most cases, but nonetheless, it doesn't seem to be any willingness in the UK, at least, to trial new ways to gauge or put some objective measures in place to diagnose mental health conditions. It's just quite crazy to me. And obviously, Emilia talked about her experience of trying to get the NHS to listen to their pitch and then try to embrace another way of looking at things for clinicians to use these tools. And she was met with bureaucracy compared to other places in the world. She mentioned Africa, where they've got a much more open-minded approach to these new tools. I really hope that does fly in the face of a lot of what I assumed was the case in the UK. I know the NHS are under lots of pressure with budgets and things like that. But I would have expected more of an appetite to embrace new ways of doing things, especially on this hyper complex subject of mental health. And I have to say, I mean, the other thing as well was just the difference between the UK and US investment landscape as well was another thing that was really interesting. I hadn't realized how different it was and how risk averse the UK and European investors are compared to their US counterparts. Emilia obviously said that if she could go back, she potentially would have moved to the US to set up this company. So I thought that was quite an interesting point. But look, so much to talk about, really. There was so many nuggets of wisdom. Emilia, I really feel quite strongly about this type of stuff. Mental health is dear to a lot of us, and I think this is diagnosing these things is going to save lives and is going to be very important. But look, it was a brilliant conversation. Thank you so much for downloading the Tech Leaders podcast. If you found this episode valuable and thought-provoking, we would really appreciate it if you could quite simply click the subscribe button and possibly even leave a review. This helps us to spread the word and reach a wider audience so that we can make a bigger impact and bring you the best guests possible. Thank you so much for downloading.